So last fall, I finally visited New York City, America's largest city by any metric you want to use. Its cultural, financial, and entertainment capital. The true definition of a world-class city, one of the most iconic cities on the entire planet. Now, while most people come here to see the sights and do the touristy things, I came here to see the infrastructure. I came to see all the bridges, all the tunnels, study the city's design, its massive transit network, its highways, and how the locals use all this stuff. With the bridges and tunnels, I was quite impressed. They are some of the most incredible engineering feats in America. The transit network is unrivaled, at least in the United States. The walkability is top-notch. It felt pretty good to stay in downtown Brooklyn and walk everywhere while my car was parked. But then we have the highways. New York. I already made a video earlier discussing the Bronx Expressway, as this is the most famous of New York's gridlock highways, and the one that I was already aware of when coming to the city. But there's one that you don't hear as much about if you're not local. That's even worse. Yes, this highway is even worse than the Bronx Expressway. In fact, after having lived in Southern California for 4 years, traveled to Chicago, Atlanta, Miami, and all of the other places you see on this map, I'd say that this highway has the worst traffic in the entire United States. That highway, my friends, is the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, commonly known as the BQE. Not only does it boast America's worst traffic, a portion of it is actually falling apart and New York doesn't know how to fix it. Hit that like button, subscribe if you love it, and let's talk about this crumbling expressway. So what exactly is the BQE? The Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, or BQE as we call it, is a section of the auxiliary interstate Highway 278 running from the Astoria neighborhood of Queens, southbound through the western side of the borough and into the Brooklyn neighborhoods of Williamsburg, downtown, and Brooklyn Heights before becoming the Gowanus Expressway after an interchange with the unsigned Interstate 478, which is also the Hugh L. Carney tunnel towards Lower Manhattan. The BQE still maintains its original 3x3 lane configuration as far as capacity goes, with the section in question having recently been reduced to 4 lanes for safety reasons, because it is literally starting to fall apart. It traverses some of the most densely populated territory on the entire interstate highway system. Just to give you some perspective, Brooklyn has more people than every other city in the United States, other than Los Angeles and New York City itself. Which leads us right into the first part of the discussion. Why is the BQE so congested all the time? Well, the obvious answer is population. Taking a look at the New York City metro as a whole, its population is a massive 20+ million, almost 7 million more than the second place Los Angeles. The city itself is extremely dense, among the most densely populated places on Earth. Now, as far as traffic flow and highways go, take a look at a city like Los Angeles, which is crisscrossed by multiple freeways. Or even better, take a look at Houston or Dallas networks, of which New York has more people than both of them combined. If you then look at New York's interstates, you'll notice that the main east-west highway, I-278, dies immediately after entering Manhattan. Interstate 80 merges into I-95 to cross the George Washington Bridge and journey across the city on the almost as bad Bronx Expressway. I-87 ends at I-278. I-495 travels through Long Island and Queens, but also dies immediately upon entering Manhattan. Other minor auxiliary interstates in the city include I-678, I-295, and Interstate 695. Most locals will refer to these by their expressway names rather than the number. Further out, I-287 serves as a sort of bypass and partial beltway for I-95 around the city. Now notice that when fully crossing the city, there are only 2 routes available, I-95 and I-278, which includes the BQE. Also bear in mind that with rare exception, all freeways in New York are limited to the 3x3 configuration when it comes to capacity. Now, New York does have a system of additional freeways called parkways that are controlled access roadways, but usually are not up to interstate standards and cannot handle truck traffic and buses, nor do any of them actually cross the city. Most of these parkways predate the interstate highway system, and their effectiveness is greatly reduced by the lack of shoulder width for breakdowns, meaning that a crash can easily shut down and back up portions of these roadways. The Belt Parkway in particular is notorious for this. Consider yourself lucky if you manage to drive on that roadway without coming to a complete stop at some point. In New York, interstates are called expressways to delineate the difference between them and the parkway system. So on the traffic flow level, all freight crossing the city must use I-95 or I-278. Any traffic going to or from Long Island to New Jersey and point south or northbound towards New England must either use the Bronx, the BQE, or take a grueling drive through Manhattan. I-95 is the most heavily used highway in the entire United States, carrying the weight of the entire East Coast and over 1/3 of the entire U.S. population served by it. It is a puny 3 lanes through the Bronx, and this is why you'll notice that the George Washington Bridge and Cross Bronx Expressway are almost always in the red on the map. While I-278 is nowhere near the regional powerhouse of interstate traffic that I-95 is, its problem is that it is the only expressway in the entire 2.7 million strong Brooklyn, meaning that it carries almost all freight traffic that enters or exits Brooklyn, as well as parts of Queens and Staten Island. It also is the only connection to Staten Island and the southbound connection between Long Island, New Jersey, and further points on the mainland. Currently, it is carrying approximately 140,000 vehicles per day. So with all that traffic that I-278 is responsible for carrying, it is also squeezed into a 3x3 lane configuration. So what is currently happening with the BQE? The BQE is a very outdated expressway from the 1940s. Over time, a combination of road salt, moisture, and the overall burden on the roadway is causing it to crumble. The highway has a 40-ton limit on trucks, but this has been repeatedly violated, also adding to its rapid deterioration. Its most prominent and unique feature is a triple cantilever with a pedestrian promenade over it that offers stunning views of the Manhattan skyline from the wealthy Brooklyn Heights neighborhood that sits adjacent to this section of the roadway. I had the opportunity to walk in this area while in New York, and I can tell you firsthand that it is quite stunning. But on the notion of the roadway, things got so bad that in August 2021, one lane on each side of the roadway was shut down to hopefully keep the roadway intact until a solution can be found. As a result, the roadway now remains in a near constant state of gridlock 24/7, nights, weekends, holidays, you name it. I was in New York for Christmas, and even on Christmas Day, this roadway was quickly crowded before your kids could even wake up and grab their presents. Some predict that closing this lane down would prolong the life of the roadway until 2036, while others say that it could last only 5 years before it may be forced to permanently close for emergency repairs. Government officials view this as a worst-case scenario and fear the catastrophic gridlock and supply chain issues that would occur if things got to this point. Various ideas have been floated as to how to address the issue. While the current Mayor Eric Adams is charged with finding a solution to the issue, proposals to fix the BQE date back to the previous administration of Bill de Blasio. The City Council recommended a tear down and rebuild the structure as it was originally designed, with the 6 lanes and non-existent shoulders. However, de Blasio called this plan a non-starter, as well as any suggestions of a temporary roadway being built while the original was under repair. He had a panel which recommended things such as pricing strategies to encourage traffic to use nearby bridges and tunnels, allowing small trucks on the Belt Parkway, increased transit options into the Red Hook area of Brooklyn, as well as new passenger ferries between Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Manhattan. It also recommended the reduction from 3 to 2 lanes to prolong the life of the structure, which appears to be the only one of these recommendations that was carried out back then. New York City DOT recommends a design that would replace the existing structure with a new, wider promenade that maintains 3 lanes of travel and also adds shoulders for emergencies, unlike the current setup. This new promenade would be 35 feet wider than the current one. Apparently, local transit officials also support this design due to new connections to the Brooklyn and Manhattan bridges, as well as room provided for improvement to the parks and bike and pedestrian connections in the area. DOT says this proposal would be the least disruptive to local streets by building a temporary elevated structure to operate for 3 years while the old roadway is rebuilt underneath, whereas the city's proposal would put more trucks and cars on the streets of Brooklyn. The cost is estimated to be $3.6 billion. This proposal has drawn intense opposition from the Brooklyn Heights neighborhood as they cite air pollution concerns from the traffic that will use it. Instead, the Brooklyn Heights neighborhood proposes a temporary parallel route that will bypass this existing structure to the west over the Brooklyn Park parking area. Now, there is yet another proposal floating around that suggests removing the roadway entirely and replacing it with a boulevard of some sort. Supporters of this idea cite things such as the Embarcadero in San Francisco and the West Side Highway right across the river in Manhattan as examples of how this will work. However, the difference with the BQE and those roads is, for one, the population of Brooklyn and Queens far exceeds that of those areas. None of them had the traffic counts that the BQE currently does. Also, there were alternate routes nearby that could reasonably absorb the traffic. Recall that the only alternative to the BQE for crosstown traffic is the Cross Bronx, and the alternative for inbound traffic is the streets of Brooklyn. And freight cannot use the nearby Belt Parkway. And then the sheer volume of freight that the BQE carries is through the roof, making the industrial and manufacturing sectors in the 2 boroughs highly dependent upon it for moving their goods. Polly Trottenberg, the DOT commissioner, stated, "A lot of trucks are delivering food, furniture, goods, you name it, here in Brooklyn and Queens. And I like this quote from former MTA Capital Construction president Michael Horodnico, who likened this idea to saying, "My arm hurts, so let me just cut it off to stop it from hurting." I suppose the supporters of this idea believe that the shelves in the stores that they shop in will magically resupply themselves. Or have we already forgotten all the crying and whining about supply chain back in 2020? Imagine that in perpetuity in Brooklyn. New York simply has not built the alternate infrastructure that would be necessary to move goods through this area without the BQE, and they're probably not going to do it anytime in the next quarter century. Sorry folks, but the goods have to be delivered. And in America, that means roads 90% of the time. The most recent design unveiled in February of this year is something called the Stoop. This design keeps the Brooklyn Heights promenade intact while expanding the lowest level to serve 4 lanes of traffic, while transforming the second level that now carries northbound traffic into a pedestrian and bike path. The 4 lanes would include a shoulder area and also reduce BQE capacity around Girolamo Street. A temporary roadway won't need to be constructed with this design, and no traffic would have to be diverted onto Brooklyn streets, as the BQE can still be used during construction. The big question with this proposal is the reduction to 4 lanes. According to the DOT, regulatory bodies may require the roadway to be 3 lanes with a shoulder, which would make this design difficult to implement without some major modifications. For the next steps in the process, the DOT is currently performing a comprehensive traffic study on the impact of 4 lanes versus 6. The overall goal is to rebuild the structure with as narrow a footprint as possible, while also maintaining modern interstate design standards. It is also studying how to redesign the interchange with Atlantic Avenue. My view on the issue is that New York City dropped the ball with this roadway over a decade ago. Brooklyn Bridge Park was built in 2010, and the city already knew this roadway was falling apart. Yet, they built a park adjacent to it. Instead, they should have repaired the roadway first and then built the park. Just poor decision making on the part of the city on that front, along with some good old-fashioned politics taking precedence over common sense. What I think should happen is that the roadway be reconstructed with the original 6 lanes, with a temporary structure for traffic while it's being rebuilt to prevent trucks and cars from being diverted onto the streets of Brooklyn. Ideally, burying the highway would be the best look, but financially it appears to be beyond what the city and state are willing to spend, understandably. So overall, the Stoop looks like a pretty ideal design if it could be done with 6 lanes, even if you have to get a waiver for 11-foot lanes to fit them in there. Besides, traffic doesn't move very fast on the BQE anyway. But if it comes down to a choice of 6 lanes with no shoulder or 4 lanes with a proper shoulder, then the 4 lanes is the better of the two. Even then, it appears that the feds will be unlikely to allow this roadway to be reduced to 4 lanes. Now, what do I think will actually happen? With all the opposing views, the political fears and gridlock, the NIMBYs, business leaders, all wanting it to be done their way, I wouldn't be surprised if nothing is done and the structure eventually is shut down or collapses. At which point it will finally be politically acceptable to just rebuild the thing as originally proposed by the DOT in the first place, similar to what it took for action to finally be taken on the West Side Highway. So either the folks of New York can deal with a less painful rebuild now, or kick the can down the road and wait for it to collapse and get a very painful taste of life without the BQE while it's being rebuilt with no temporary roadway to keep trucks off these Brooklyn streets. But hopefully I'm wrong on that prediction. In the meantime, if you're traveling to New York, as recommended on my Rules of Driving in New York video, continue to avoid the BQE at all costs. In fact, just take the train or ride your bike. Your bike or scooter might move faster than the cars on the BQE. But what do you guys think? Have you ever traveled on the BQE? If so, what was your experience? Why did you drive on the BQE instead of using transit? Which of these proposals to address the situation do you prefer? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one, coming soon to a town near you.